That, of course, on the Emmaus Road story, we do indeed see Jesus holding back, waiting, listening. But there, of course, are other stories where Jesus responds in a very different way. So with Zacchaeus, for instance, he's much more directive. In a way, that for me reinforces my point that Jesus is not formulaic. The way he responds to one person in one situation is different from the way he responds to another person in another situation. His antennae are out to knowing what is the right way, the right thing to respond to this person or that person. We see the same in the Acts of the Apostles with St. Paul. What St. Paul says in Corinth is radically different to what he says in Athens. He doesn't go around just preaching the same sermon over and over again. He engages with the culture and the people he's with, and the way he responds is different. That's the thing to learn from this. Secondly, one of you's written a poem, so thank you so much. I won't read the whole poem out, if you don't mind, but I have read the poem, and it's a very beautiful poem. Let me tell you the good news. Let me tell you the bad news. The good news is that Jesus saves you. The bad news is that he does not save you from suffering and grief. The good news is that you will meet him and your life will be changed. The bad news is that you may be changed slowly. So slowly. The good news is that God will not give you more than you can bear. The bad news is that you may be broken. The good news is that God works in your life. The bad news is that you will not always see it. And the good news is that you will never be alone in your suffering. The good news is that you are loved just as you are. The good news is that God comes to you in bread and wine, in other people, Christian or not, in the beauty of nature, in the sacredness of worship. The good news is that he heals your brokenness. The good news is that he holds your heart and your complete being in his infinite tenderness. Oh, so thank you, whoever it was that wrote that poem. I can't see you, but you know who you are. Thank you for writing that beautiful, I did read the whole poem, a beautiful poem. And you never quite know when a poem is going to seize you, so if you find yourself seized. I was in a meeting of the House of Bishops of the Church of England at Lambeth Palace last year, a very important meeting. The Archbishop of Canterbury was probably addressing us and we were discussing something very important thing. And walking over Lambeth Bridge to Lambeth Palace, I was suddenly seized with an idea for a poem. And the opening line of the poem that came to me was, "Crows do not fly as the crow flies." And it just, I don't know when, this thought comes into your head. Crows, which they don't. A crow does not fly as the crow flies. When we say, as the crow flies, we usually mean, what is the shortest distance between A and B? But that's not how crows do it. So the second line of the poem was, they ride the thermals. And then I'm walking over Lambeth Bridge, so I'm looking at the River Thames, and then the third line of the poem came, rivers do not run from A to B. They follow the contours of the land. So I thought, oh right, we've got a poem here. So then I'm at Lambeth Palace, important meeting of the House of Bishops, but I can't get the poem out of my head. So I'm paying no attention, like the writer of this poem, paid no attention to the I'm paying no attention to the House of Bishops meeting because I'm puzzling away. I think I've got a poem here somewhere. So I spent most of the session scribbling away. And the nice thing about writing poems is it looks like you're taking notes. Next to me is the godly Bishop of Coventry, who turns to me at the tea break and says, "Stephen," he says, "were you writing a poem in that session?" And I thought, oh, I can't deny it. And I said, oh yes, Christopher, I'm afraid I was. My poem was called, I did finish it, my poem was called "A Curse on the Strategic Planners." Crows don't fly as the crow flies. Rivers don't run from A to B. Anyway, back to the subject in hand. So if you're seized by a poem, or if you feel like you need to sleep, this is the wall to bang your head against. Please just do your thing. Otherwise, you're going to be listening to me for another hour. Why don't you talk to each other for 2 or 3 minutes? So we spent a lot of time thinking about that Emmaus Road story as the paradigm for an Anglican way of approaching the catechumenal task that is entrusted to the church. Jesus doesn't say at the end of Matthew's Gospel, go into all the world and make churchgoers. He doesn't say go into all the world and make converts. He says go and make disciples. The authentic mark of the disciple is the one whose life is so turned around that they can't wait to share with others what they have received. That is the Catholic vision. So having explored that story, just 2 or 3 minutes to get us back from coffee where you are. So what does that teach us about this ministry of evangelism, catechesis that is entrusted to us? 2 or 3 minutes, then we're off again. Okay, so could we come back together, please? Your conversations are so animated that I feel sure you must be talking about something else. So I thought I'd better draw you back together. So rooted in that paradigm shift about how we think about the work of evangelism theologically, how we recover a catechumenal way of thinking about this, I have a model to share with you. This is the one practical bit of the whole 3 days, so I hope this might actually be something of practical value and usefulness for when you get back to your parish. So this is a model that I've been working on for the last 20 or so years as a way of trying to understand what we might call an Anglican Catholic way of understanding the ministry of evangelism. And in order to understand the model, we have to begin with the caricature. And the caricature of evangelism is this. There are people out there in Wellington who are not Christians. There's us in here in the church who are Christians. The task of evangelism is this. We need to get up out of our seats. We need to go out into the streets of Wellington. It's a lovely day. There's lots of people out there. We need to go and share with them the good news of Jesus Christ. They will repent of their sins and they will look around for a church to join. Okay? That's the ministry of evangelism. I can't for a moment understand why we're wasting our time sitting here talking about it. Let's get up out of our seats now. Let's go out into the streets of Wellington. Let's just get on with it. Well, the trouble with that approach to evangelism, let's call it the gung-ho, let's go out and get 'em approach, is that it divides us. And it divides us on all sorts of lines, not least personality. Some of us just can't imagine ourselves, even if we think that's what we ought to be doing, we simply can't imagine ourselves ever doing such a thing. And we also have this sneaking suspicion that if we did do such a thing, it wouldn't be effective. In fact, we even think it might be counterproductive, that we would come over, just as an irritant and irrelevance. Nobody would listen to us. We would end up being like that teacher, Jesus is the answer, what's the question? We would just disconnect. And the people who draw this conclusion often end up in the Anglican Church, and particularly in the Catholic end of the Anglican Church. We just can't imagine that this is the way to do things. But often, if we're honest with ourselves, we carry a little bit of guilt because we think maybe we should be doing something like this. And that brings us back to, I think, what I mentioned earlier. The Anglican model of evangelism is something other Christians do. And then they graduate into the Anglican Church because we're the superior brand. And so we just don't do anything about it. And each year, it does happen, doesn't it? Each year in our churches, people kind of trickle into our churches, recovering from other denominations, where they've been bashed over the head with the gospel. They find, so it does kind of happen. I think maybe it'd be good if it never happened, because that would waken us up to the real challenge, which is that this model is insufficient. It doesn't actually describe what God is doing. because God is the evangelist, not us. So, some research has been done, quite a lot of research, into how adults become Christians. I'm not aware of any specific New Zealand research, but I expect it exists. But certainly in North America, certainly in the UK, a lot of research has been done as to how adults become Christians right across the spectrum of denominations. And all the evidence says this, that for most people, usually about 70 or 75% of people, becoming a Christian is best understood as being like a journey. And the average length of time for that journey is 4 years. That's 4 years between contact, and now I'm not thinking about contact necessarily with the evangelizing Christian out on the streets. I'm thinking of contact with God. That's where we were when we began yesterday afternoon. It is God that is interesting and exciting. It is God that motivates us. And people are having contact with God in all sorts of ways. Through the birth of a child, through the death of a loved one, through seeing a movie, through reading a book, through listening to a nocturne by Chopin, by looking into a star-filled sky. All kinds of ways. There is what I think I want to call a chink in the armour of people's secular worldview. And that God, if I muddle my metaphors, God is coming in under the radar of their worldview, opening themselves up to the possibility that maybe there's more to life than what I see around me. That is happening all the time. That people are having some sense of the otherness of God. Just a glimpse or a hint. Now what the research shows is from that first moment of, well, maybe there is a God, maybe there is something, from that moment to commitment to Jesus Christ and membership of the church, the average length of time is 4 years. The Billy Graham Association in North America did some research only a couple of years ago on this, and their research disagreed with this finding. The Billy Graham Association discovered that the average length of time was 5 years. So if you've got some lingering churchmanship, prejudice in your head about this, cast it out. It doesn't matter whether you are a swinging from the chandeliers charismatic or a swinging the thurible Anglo-Catholic. Everybody who's trying to seriously work with engaging with our culture in evangelization is discovering that for most people, about 75%, becoming a Christian is best understood as being like a journey. That is the key insight. Therefore, the work of evangelism is best understood as helping people make the journey. It is much more an Emmaus Road model of accompanying people on a journey than the more Damascus Road dramatic experience. That used to be the case. I mean, in the 1950s, I'm sure Billy Graham came to New Zealand, he certainly came to England. That model of evangelism was much more effective. The big preach, inviting people to make a response. The reason it was still effective in the 50s and 60s was because there was still a large proportion of the population in New Zealand and in the UK who knew about the Christian faith, who had been to church themselves, who had perhaps lapsed from church, but had in some sense been formed by the Christian tradition. So Billy Graham and his kind were preaching to a situation where the Christian faith was already there in the culture. That situation is no longer the case. There's some people like that, but most people in New Zealand, in the UK, are growing up with little or no knowledge of the Christian faith, little or no contact with the Christian church. Therefore, the model for engaging with those people has to change. And the church hasn't yet caught up with that. We're either still operating on old models which are no longer effective, trying to engineer this moment of response, or we're not doing anything at all. And that is a scandal. This is what has been entrusted to us as the Church of Jesus Christ, to live and share the gospel with others so that the whole world might be transformed. Therefore, it's not sufficient or acceptable for us to say, we don't do this. We need to find a way of doing it which is right for our culture and spirituality, but even more important than that, which is the ways in which God is showing us this is how we might effectively share our faith. So, well, let's just do a test in the room. Let's just see if the research works. We haven't got time. Again, if we had a week, you could all tell each other your story of how you became part of the church. But for the moment, could we just could I just ask, is there anybody here? I mean, some people can tell you not only what day they became a Christian, they can tell you what hour. You know, they had a sudden and dramatic experience of God. But there will be some people in this room, I think, for whom that will be their story. So if you had a sudden and dramatic experience of God which brought you into the life of the church, would you mind just putting up your hand? So I think that's 6 people. But that's slightly less than usual, actually. But usually, you know, so would I be right in thinking, we'll test it out, would I be right in thinking that the rest of us would, as we describe our story, would say that it was much more for us like a journey? Let's just see by putting up our hands. Okay, so unsurprisingly for me, we conform exactly to actually more than the research. The research would suggest there should have been about 15 of us, maybe 20 of us, who had had a sudden experience. So, if that is the case, why do we think our evangelism has to kind of create and engineer that moment of response? Why are we not working with a different model? So, this is what I am suggesting the different model looks like. Between contact and commitment, a journey takes place. And the word that I am using to describe that journey is nurture. And it's deliberately the same word that we use to describe how we bring up our children. Because it's not just one ministry, it's a whole host of ministries and influences as we accompany people on a journey from that initial moment of maybe there is something, which is something we can be involved in, through a whole series of ministries which in God's good time lead to commitment and church membership. Notice we haven't taken away the central line, because God is God. And God does continue to zap some people who have sudden and dramatic experiences. However, if you're somebody who put up your hand for the sudden and dramatic experience, this did not mean you also did not need to be nurtured into your faith, even though you'd had a dramatic experience of God. So, being intentional about the work of nurture is one of the primary things the missionary church needs to be involved in. And every church in New Zealand and every church in the UK should have what I'm calling a place of nurture. A place where those who are not yet Christians can discover, find out about, and explore the Christian faith. And this is what I also notice is what is, I think, a worldwide movement of the Spirit to renew the catechumenates in the church. It's happening in the Catholic Church, it's certainly happening in many parts of the Anglican Church, and I think in other denominations, where we are discovering ways of nurturing people into the Christian faith who are not yet Christians. Now let's just explore the diagram a bit more. By contact, I've made it clear I'm not just talking about contact with the church, but contact with God, though of course contact with God can happen through the ministry of the church. Isn't that what we're good at? You know, let's not beat ourselves up all the time. Isn't that particularly what we're good at as Anglicans? One of the great things about the Anglican Church is our engagement with the local community, our engagement with social justice, our engagement with the things of the kingdom. This brings us into contact with lots of people and lots of organisations and lots of communities. It is one of our great strengths. However, what we're often not good at doing is building the places of nurture where those who want to find out more can take the next step. And that is one of the missing things. I'm not suggesting some of your churches aren't doing this already. Please forgive me if it comes over that way. I'm just saying this is somewhere where we need to put much greater emphasis, and where some of us maybe need to get started. I go to churches and people often say to me, Bishop, the question is, how can we get more people to come to church? And it's a really boring question. Could I suggest that you never ask the question again? Or else they say, how can we get more young people to come to church? Right? It's just a really, really, really tedious question. Stop asking. It's the wrong question. The reason it's the wrong question is because the question, for it to be effective, rests on a premise which is incorrect, which is that everybody who doesn't yet go to church is at this stage of the journey. Now, there are a few people at that stage of the journey who will respond to your invitation to come to church, and that's great. Don't stop inviting them. But we need to recognise that in our culture today, most people are here. Now, most people are not atheists, though actually I think the numbers of those who self-identify as atheists is on the increase. It hadn't been for years, but it is on the increase. But it still means that the majority of people do not self-identify as atheists, but they don't self-identify as Christian or any other religion for that matter. Most people are just kind of, I don't know what we call them, interested unbelievers, just kind of good, honest people, interested in life, wanting the best for life, but not yet people of faith. So if how can we get them to come to church is the wrong question, you would be entitled to ask, what is the right question? And here, for one night only, I have for you the right question. I would be the first to acknowledge it is not a snappy question, but it's a carefully crafted question, and if I might, hopefully with due humility, say, this is a question worth asking in your local church. Your next, you call it the vestry meeting? Vestry meeting, is that the right language? Your next vestry meeting, put a red pen through the whole agenda and just put this question on the agenda, nothing else. And you will be surprised where it leads you, especially if you do a brief Bible study on the Emmaus Road story first, just to warm people up to a different way of looking at this ministry. So here's the question. How can we serve the people with whom we already have contact in such a way as to make the gospel intriguing, challenging, and appealing? Now note, it doesn't say, how can we convert the people? It doesn't say, how can we get the people to come to church? It says, how can we serve the people? It is an Emmaus Road approach. It is, what are you discussing as you walk along? Why are you weeping? Who are you looking for? How can we serve you? And it also plays to the strengths of the Anglican tradition. Our engagement with our communities, our engagement with issues of social justice, the things that we are already doing well. And it says, how can we serve people? But how can we serve not just anybody? Here we set the bar reasonably low. The people we've already got contact with. And we have got contact in our churches with hundreds and hundreds of people. But in such a way that the gospel is intriguing, challenging, and appealing. Now here I'm going to tell you a story to illustrate what happens when you ask this question. I don't tell you this story because I want you to copy what this story tells, but as an illustration of what happens. So literally, you put this question before your vestry, or you do it instead of a sermon on a Sunday morning, or after Mass, you get everyone together and say, let's look at this question. So first of all, you say, who are the people we've got contact with? And you will be very encouraged very quickly, because very quickly you will produce a big list of groups of people that you have contact with through the ministry of your church. Then you ask the question, the Emmaus Road question, what are these people discussing as they walk along? What are their concerns? What are their needs? What are their interests? And you write those down. And then you say, so how could we as a church serve those needs? The sorts of things that we're good at doing. How can we do that? And then how can we do it in such a way that something of the story of the gospel might be communicated? So here's the story of what happened to one church. This is a church in a rural part of England, a small congregation, probably, 20 or 30 people in church on a Sunday. They have a church. We have a lot of church schools in England. They have a church primary school in the parish. They also have a church hall where a parent and toddler group meets, 2 or 3 times a week, preschool children. So when they asked themselves this question, they immediately realised, hey, we have contact with virtually every family that lives in this community, but most of them do not come to church. In fact, on a Sunday, there's only 2 families that come to church. So we've got very few children in church on Sunday, but loads of contact with all the children through the school and the preschool stuff. So straight away they said, well, these are the people we need to serve. Then they asked themselves the question, normally they've been asking, how can we get them to come to church? That's what they'd normally been asking, and it had got them nowhere. They'd really tried hard at Mothering Sunday, they tried hard at Harvest Festival, they tried hard at Christmas. With modest success, people would come at Christmas, but then you wouldn't see them again until next Christmas. That was good, but they longed for more. But they were still operating on a come-to-church model, and it wasn't really working. Now they're asking a different question. Not how can we get them to come to church, how could we serve them? And this completely changed the conversation. And they came to the conclusion that in their fairly affluent village, where most people commuted to work, where usually mum and dad both worked, if there was mum and dad, where children were often coming to the preschool because the parents were, dropping off the kids and then going to work and wouldn't see them again until they actually thought being a parent, the whole issue of parenting, was the thing that concerned these parents most. So to cut a long story short, they put on a one-off evening, not in the church, in somebody's home. So one of the 2 parents who did come to church organised the event. And they printed invitations, which they handed out at the toddler group and at the school gate. The invitation wasn't come to church, the invitation was come to an evening, which we're happening in our home, to talk about how we can be better parents. And they called the evening Questions Children Ask. And once you've heard the title of the evening, you can almost kind of half guess what happened. So, from memory, about 15 or 16 parents came to so it wasn't like a big event. About 15 or 16 parents came to this one person's house. There was food and drink. By the way, it wasn't difficult to invite people. And that was, for them, one of the great learnings was, it was easy to invite people. Whereas it was quite hard to invite people to come to church, it was quite easy to invite them to this event because they knew this event was connecting with the real issues and needs of these people. Food and drink. While they're eating the food and drink, they hand around bits of paper on which is written, the question I most fear being asked by my child is... And then people filled in the blanks. There wasn't an expert at the front giving the answers. After they'd eaten, they put the questions in a hat, they pulled them out one at a time. There was discussion about the issues that parents face bringing up kids today. You can imagine the kind of questions there were. The Christian faith took its place alongside other world views, but of course we know the Christian faith has something to say about the whole of life. So there was an opportunity to speak about this is how we as the church see these things. Who are you looking for? some of the moral questions that came up. There was an opportunity to talk about, well, we do need a moral compass in our lives. We have found that. We, the one or two Christians who were there, we have found that through our life in Christ. However, one question was very specific. One mum wrote, the question I most fear being asked by my 6-year-old daughter is what happens to Granny when she dies. And this was not a hypothetical question. Her mother was dying at the time. So various people gave various responses about what you say to a child about death and dying. The Christian mum in the room simply said, look, you're going to have to work out what you're going to say, but this is what I would say. And suddenly, using Paul's wonderful phrase about a door of opportunity opening, suddenly, in this event, this little door of opportunity opened where for a minute or two, one person said something about the hope that they had found in Christ. At the end of the evening, which was a one-off, this happened. That the host parent stood up and said, thank you for coming this evening. This has been a one-off. However, if you've enjoyed this evening, is this something we would like to do again? And most people in the room said, yes, we'd love to do this again. This has been a good thing to do. Secondly, she said, if you would like to find out more about the Christian faith, we have this thing at our church. Oh, I need the diagram back up. This kind of place of nurture thing. We have something at our church which is designed for people to find out about the Christian faith. Just for a moment, put up in your head Acts 17, Paul in Athens. If you're not familiar with the story, this can be today's homework. John 6 last night, Acts 17 tonight. Read Acts 17, Paul in Athens. At the end it says, some people scoffed at Paul, some people followed in the way, and some people said, we would like to hear more about this. Now that is such a common response today when we approach evangelism in this way. It's not people saying, where I want to come to church, where do I sign? It's people saying, I would like to find out more. And we need to become a church that is better equipped to help people find out more. So we need a place of nurture. And they found it very easy to say, if you'd like to find out more, we do this thing at our church. Two people of the 15 or 16 who came said, there and then that evening, actually, I would like to find out more about the Christian faith. And when they spoke to them afterwards, they discovered, and this is my hunch is this is true for so many people, is actually for quite a long time. They'd had this sense of God, these people, but they didn't know what to do with it. And they didn't want to come to church because coming to church made such a big expectation of them that they, in order to sing our hymns and say our creeds, you've got to believe some of this stuff. They didn't know what they believed, but they did want to find out. And now at last, somebody was offering them the opportunity to find out. Those two people, sometime later, were received into the church. They were baptized, they were confirmed, they took their place around the Lord's table. Now that is real evangelism. Not scalp hunting for Jesus, not shouting slogans, but actually accompanying people on a journey that eventually, in God's good time, leads to faith. So, this is a question worth asking, and it's a question that we can place at the centre of our evangelisation in our parishes. It requires us to have a ministry of making contact, which builds upon our existing strengths. It leads to us building places of nurture, but just slightly to complicate matters, but also in a way make them more beautiful. The other thing I need to alert you to is that that place of nurture might be a stepping stone into the gold standard of your Sunday Mass at 10 o'clock. It might be. But the thing which I think God is also doing at the moment, particularly I think in New Zealand and particularly I think in the Diocese of Wellington, is that those places of nurture aren't stepping stones towards the real thing, church on Sunday. They are church. They are church. And this is the really challenging, beautiful vision of what the Holy Spirit is doing through the church at the moment. The renewal of the catechumenate. Because, that place of nurture might be, you must have heard of the Alpha Course. The Alpha Course must have reached New Zealand. I'm sure when Nicky leave aside for a moment whether you like the content of the Alpha Course. The Alpha Course is part of a worldwide renewal of the catechumenate. It is a way of engaging with the Christian faith as a place of nurture. I'm the author of the marvellous Pilgrim and Emmaus course, which are very consciously part of the renewal of the catechumenate. There are lots of other resources, many of them New Zealand homegrown resources. We need resources to help us build that place of nurture. But the renewal of the catechumenate is happening alongside the renewal of the religious life. And the renewal of the religious life might be the even more significant thing that's happening in the church at the moment. And it's absolutely rooted in the Catholic tradition that we've not always been good at owning what God is doing around us in this. So I do know in this diocese where we are at the moment, there's all sorts of experiments in young people living together in community that your bishop has been instrumental in pioneering. And it's a wonderful thing. And it's happening right across the world. And sometimes these little groups of people, so that group of parents meeting in that person's home, that might become the church, not just be the stepping stone towards the church. And we need to be very, very open to what God is doing in what I see as the renewal of the religious life, particularly amongst young people. Many young people don't want to come to church, but they do want to be the church. And they want to be the church and express that in community. And there are many examples of this, of groups of young people living together, living a common life, leading a simple rule of life, a life of prayer and a life of service. And we of all people in the Catholic tradition ought to be rejoicing in this and getting behind it and doing all that we can to nurture it in our communities. Just to finish the diagram, because Jesus didn't say go into all the world and make converts or churchgoers but disciples, the journey of course doesn't end when you come to church or when you become church. It overflows into what I'm calling growth, that ongoing work of discipleship that all of us are part of. That's why we're here now. And by growth, I don't mean going and doing a degree in God. I mean the life of prayer, the life of service, the apostolic life, our sharing in the apostolic sent-out vocation to be the people of God in and for the world, the work of social justice, the prophetic vocation of the church, that the world must be changed. All that stuff is the life of our common discipleship. But this isn't a circle that goes round and round. It's a spiral by which the church grows. So what for me is interesting is, as Anglicans, we used to think evangelism looks like this and said, we can't do that. But now we discover that if you build a place of nurture, then those with whom you have contact, some of them will make the journey and will become part of the church. And if you focus on discipleship in your churches, this will have a huge impact. The more that we grow in our faith, the more that we will have an impact in the lives of others, in communities, in our places of work. And that's how the church grows. So we will come back to more of this tomorrow, particularly this growth bit about how we can't give what we haven't got. That's where this is heading. But we've got 5 or 6 minutes now. If anybody has a question, a comment, or an observation, that they wish to make. Otherwise, you'll be relieved to hear I'm done for today. Oh, yes.
Something I said earlier, as a kidney transplant recipient, I find there was nothing more transforming to my whole life than knowing someone else had taken the debt that was coming to me and given me their life in exchange. And that's exactly what the good news is.
Yeah, thank you.
There's nothing more transforming than that.
Yeah.
Your whole life around.
Yeah. Thank you. And just by saying that, what you bear witness to is that simple truth that the most powerful thing we have to do is share our own story. This is what God is for me. And if we simply share and tell that story, it will have an impact in other people's lives. Now, we don't need to impose it on people, force it upon them, so you must now therefore respond yourself. But the story has a great power. And we need to tell that story in creative ways. I mean, either just by telling it, as you just have, through poems, through pictures, through stories, through music, through art. There's so many ways that we can tell the story which will start to have an impact in the people we serve. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, and that's your picture of Christian truly helping us to go to New Zealand, even if it is going to New Zealand.
Oh, yes, yeah.
It's been for quite a few years. And this printer and CPAC is a graduate from school offer that he had in his friends on the trip this way forward. Now found in being sort of bright lights and a little extra physical lights going on.
Yeah. Well, as I say, building a place of nurture, I think, is one of the practical outworkings of what I'm sharing with you these few days. Intentional discipleship on this side, nurturing those who are not yet Christians on this side, and finding the resources that work for you. Even though I've written two of the most widely used resources in the Church of England, I have a very low doctrine of the resources. I don't care what you use. And often the homemade ones are the best. But it's not negotiable that we should have a place of nurture. Your bishop ought to be able to phone you up and ask you, say to you, look, I know somebody who lives in your parish who wants to find out more about the Christian faith. What can you do for them? You ought to be able to answer immediately. And if the only answer you can give is that I will visit them, that is not a sufficient answer, because that means that your whole evangelism is limited by the availability in your diary, which is not much. Wendy? Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Wendy. Rowan Williams, previous Archbishop of Canterbury, coined the phrase a mixed economy church. I think it's a very helpful way of thinking about the life of the church today. That we can't I'm not suggesting we abandon Sunday at all. We need to nurture and cherish what we've received on Sunday. But we do need to be looking to give birth to new expressions of Christian community in different ways, which probably won't be on Sunday. And there's no reason. The trouble has been that, ironically, that those of us who are inheritors of the Catholic tradition, which is from whence the whole revival of the religious life came, we're the ones who don't recognise that this is our stuff, this is our tradition, but we don't seem to have noticed that. When I was a parish priest, we had a Eucharist on a Wednesday morning, which usually about 6 people came to, and I noticed over a couple of years that it was growing. And now, whereas we used to have 6, now we had 10. And I visited the 3 or 4 people who now came every Wednesday, and found that each of them didn't come on Sunday, and they had a really good reason why they didn't come on Sunday, which I found irritating. Because I was still working on the model that Sunday was the gold standard, and if you're a proper Christian, you'd come to Mass on Sunday, but they were coming to Mass on Wednesday. And one of them couldn't come on Sunday because they worked on Sunday. And another one of them, her husband was very much against church, and so it became a battleground, so Wednesday was better for her. These people had good reasons. At last the penny dropped. I'm fighting a rearguard action to keep Sunday special. The Holy Spirit has danced on ahead of me and is blessing Wednesdays. When that dawned on me, I threw resources into Wednesday. We started having coffee after the service on Wednesday. I always preach at Mass, but now I did a bit more work on the sermon. That frightened a few people away, but generally wasn't a bad tactic. Once a month, we would go back to the vicarage after the Mass on Wednesday to do kind of nurture, growth, discipleship stuff. By the time I left that parish, the congregation on Wednesday was between 30 and 40 people, over half of whom never came on Sundays. Now that's just a really small and modest example of the way in which we respond to the culture in which we are set, and find different ways of expressing the life of the church. And there's all sorts of other stories I could tell you, but that's the most modest and obvious one. Yes?
Marlon Bishop, just reflecting on your take on evangelism, sharing the good news with non-Christian, in my experience and journey with faith, thinking on evangelism, I think of another lens of those who have been churchgoers for years but have been hurt or turned away from church, so they've broken away. Does evangelism still fit for them, or?
Yes, it does.
Same as for non-Christians.
Yeah, the question is, what about those who've been deeply damaged by the church, of which there are many, sadly. Yes, evangelism, I think, does still work for them, but if the starting point of our evangelism is what Jesus says on the first Easter day, why are you weeping? Who are you looking for? What are you discussing as you walk along? If that is our starting point, so it's not, I've got something to sell to you, and I hope you're going to buy it, and I'm going to try to be as persuasive as I can, but actually I'm coming in servant mode and listening mode. Because I believe that God has called me to walk alongside you, and that I want us to be a church that walks alongside and believes that God will open doors of opportunity in those conversations and relationships. If that's what evangelism is, and if we're relaxed about it, don't be anxious about it. It's not your job to convert anybody. That's a relief, isn't it? It's not your job. Your job is to be the good companion, the living signpost, the faithful witness, the midwife. That's your job. Then I think it just transforms the way we approach it, and therefore is as relevant for the people you've described as anybody else. In fact, perhaps more relevant, because they really have got some hurts that we need to hear about. We've probably got time for one more question. So the lady near the back. Thank you. Thank you. That's a very beautiful story with which to end. I'm not sure everybody would have heard it, so very, very quickly let me repeat it, which is somebody saying that they became a Christian later in life. They were involved as a volunteer with some work the church was doing in sort of social outreach project to the poor. Said to the clergy, look, we're all here, why aren't you trying to convert us? Isn't that your job? And the priest saying, well, no, that's not our job. Our job is to live out our Christian vocation. And yet, of course, it worked because you're here telling the story. So I think probably those priests were trying to convert you. I think they were trying to convert you, and they succeeded, but they were trying to do it in a very Christ-like way. And that's what I'm saying is, I don't misunderstand me. We must be intentional about sharing the Christian faith. It has been entrusted to us to do that. We need to be intentional about it, but we need to be intentional in a Christ-like way. And it's the Christ-like way on the Emmaus Road which seems to me to be a model which fits with our Anglican and Catholic tradition, and it also fits with the cultures we are called to serve. But we are intentional about it, and let me be clear, I long for people to know God's love in Jesus Christ. I long for that, because I believe that will be the fulfillment of their lives and the fulfillment of the world. But we have to do it in the most Christ-like way we can, and we must trust that God the evangelist will do God's stuff and we do our stuff.